How does Israel use Palestinians as guinea pigs to test its weapons and sell them abroad? This is something that pro-Palestine activists have long warned about, and I'm joined now by the investigative journalist Antony Leowenstein, whose book and new film, The Palestine Laboratory, meticulously documents what is happening. Antony, thanks for joining us this morning from Sydney.
Thanks so much for having me, Phil.
I can't believe we haven't done this interview sooner. We've worked together for many years. You're involved with Declassified Australia, a kind of sister project to Declassified UK. And your book has really taken off over the last 15 months. And of course, now you've got the film that's just come out on Al Jazeera, which we're talking to you about today. So how hard was it for you to get into Israel? And also, were you surprised by what you found?
The film is in two parts. The first part is set in Israel, Palestine, and the second part is where I travel the world. I go to India, Greece, Mexico, South Africa, and then back to Israel, Palestine. And the idea really was to, I guess, detail for people what the reality of the laboratory looks like for Palestinians on the ground. People, I think, often maybe don't quite understand that Palestinians need to hide their emotions when they're walking around, that the use of facial recognition technology, biometric data, various other tools that Israel's using means that if there's a perception, rightly or wrongly, that you as a Palestinian look angry, are angry, you are perceived as a threat meaning to settlers or soldiers, you can be arrested, neutralized, namely killed, or taken in for questioning. So I guess what in some ways shocked me. I lived for many years in Palestine. I was based in Israel and Palestine. I've been visiting there for 20 years. But what I think has accelerated is both the extent of the surveillance of all Palestinians from the moment they wake up, if they use their mobile phones, if they use their internet, and the use, of course, of AI in Gaza, artificial intelligence.
I've come to Tel Aviv to meet the investigative team who first revealed how AI is being used in Gaza.
Some in the military felt that the systems that existed were not giving them in previous wars enough targets. Talk a little bit about what that meant practically.
In previous war, what is called in Israel the target bank was very swiftly was empty. Previously, they would produce 200, 300 targets a year, and now they can produce it in an hour.
We also uncovered and detailed in a way that I don't think any other filmmaker has yet the reality in India. A lot of people aren't aware that India is unbelievably close with Israel. The biggest purchaser of Israeli weapons every year is now India, roughly 45-50%. And increasingly Indian officials are seeing how the Israelis do so-called crowd control. So we spent time in Punjab state, not that far from Delhi, where a number of Sikh farmers have been protesting about incredibly bad conditions for their lives. And earlier in 2024, they suddenly found themselves surrounded and experiencing tear gas dropped by drones. And the officials had learned that, and they had seen that from what Israel was doing in Gaza during the Great March of Return in 2018. So this is a classic, clear example of how Israeli tactics against Palestinians are directly related to what's happening in a country on the other side of the world, in India.
This Israeli weaponry that's being used on Gaza, most of us watch it with complete horror, but there are obviously people who will watch it and think, well, maybe that's the kind of weaponry that we should be purchasing for our countries. And something that we've both done as journalists is go to these arms fairs that happen around the world. So at Declassified, I think the last one we went to was a month before October 7th, the DSEI arms fair in London, where there were all the main Israeli arms companies were there. And your film actually starts at the Farnborough Air Show. I think it was filmed last year when the war in Gaza was in full, raging at its height.
It was.
Were you shocked to see that companies like Elbit Systems were still able to have these huge stalls?
I mean, yes, is the short answer. And one of the things that I think should be made clear is for anyone looking at October 7 objectively, they would say, well, all the Israeli technology failed. Literally everything collapsed. From the Israeli perspective, that Hamas are essentially a guerrilla force. They're not a sophisticated army. And yet, despite that, all these Israeli companies, Phil, Elbit and others, are soaring. In fact, they've never had higher profits. At the beginning of episode 1, we go to the Farnborough Air Show in your country, the UK. So it's not like this is hidden. Some of the deal making is done privately, as you would know. It's not like it's all done in the open. But these companies are not exactly shying away from. They're proud of what they're doing. And this comes down to the one word that explains so much of what goes on in Palestine. It's impunity. Complete and utter impunity. You wouldn't have huge amounts of Israeli soldiers literally filming themselves committing war crimes in Gaza and putting it on TikTok or Instagram if they're worried about being caught. The Israeli arms industry has never been more successful, and many, many countries are looking to Israel. Yes, its use of AI, quadcopters, mass surveillance, their adoption of big tech tools like Google Photos, for example, which Israel has been using in Gaza to document and map huge amounts of Palestinian civilians, with the permission, clearly, of Google. Microsoft is a key partner to the IDF, providing huge amounts of cloud services, as is Amazon. So when we talk about the Israeli military-industrial complex, obviously that's a lot to do with Israeli companies. But frankly, it could not actually occur, yes, without US political backing, but big tech, because Israel could not commit genocide in Gaza without Microsoft, Google, and Amazon.
And currently in the UK, there's a kind of mini arms embargo on sales of weapons to Israel. But something, a kind of talking point that the Israel lobby have used to try and push back against this policy is to say that actually Israel exports far more weapons to Britain than Britain exports to Israel. Now, is there any truth in that from the research that you've done? Have you seen the British Army using Israeli equipment, for instance? Things like,
yes.
I think Smart Shooter is one of the products
Yes.
mentioned in your film, and we've written a bit about that at Declassified.
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, Smart Shooter is one example. It's an Israeli company. It provides many of the so-called accurate targeting systems that Israeli soldiers are using in Gaza. There is an AI-controlled gun in Hebron in the West Bank that is by Smart Shooter. There is an Australian offshoot of that company, which now exists in my country and I think in yours as well. The only reason the UK is buying these weapons from Israel is for two reasons. One, because they're battle-tested usually in Palestine. That's how these systems work, either Gaza or the West Bank. And because I think the British military and political elite, regardless of who's in Downing Street, whether it's Tory or Labour, it actually doesn't make a huge amount of difference, see that their deference and support for Israel is partly about supporting the arms industry in Israel itself. This is an ideological project. Yes, I mean, if the weapons didn't work, so to speak, I guess the UK wouldn't buy them. But it's not, I don't see it as just about weapons. The Israeli arms industry is infused with a deep sense of racial superiority. Now, what does that mean? I think many countries and many elites now see it as much more of a patriotic duty to support the Israeli arms industry and therefore Israel, as Israel's economy has taken a bit of a hit. And I fear now with Trump's recent, it seems like a brain fart, but I think it's actually potentially worse than that, the idea of clearing out, ethnically cleansing Gazans from Gaza, that I think it's very conceivable that some Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, which apparently they're talking to, could take some. I mean, with a gun at their head, 50,000 here, 100,000. Palestinian friends of mine in Gaza and elsewhere said even if some may have considered temporarily maybe leaving because there's nothing in Gaza left, knowing what Trump and Israel's plan is to essentially never allow them back makes it far, far less likely that many Palestinians will go, because historically they know that if they leave 48, 67, 2024 or 5, they're not going to be allowed back in, and it's their homeland. And that's something that I think Trump and Israel ignores at their peril.
It's not a complex thing to do. And with the United States being in control of that piece of land, a fairly large piece of land, you're going to have stability in the Middle East for the first time. And the Palestinians, or the people that live now in Gaza, will be living beautifully in another location.
Israel is not just selling weapons and technology and surveillance tech and border tech. They're doing all that. But they're selling an idea. almost like a model of not just ethno-nationalism, of control, of separating people, of being a so-called successful nation that has repelled Palestinians. Israel's a tiny country in the Middle East, tiny population. And yet to be the ninth biggest arms dealer in the world happens for a reason. It happens because so many countries, democracies and dictatorships, including in the UK, there is really a desperate desire to sell weapons to Israel and to receive weapons from Israel. And there's no real checks about whether those weapons are being used in war crimes. There's no real interest in doing so. And that's not going to matter whether Starmer's in Downing Street or some other faceless Tory.
Antony, your new film, The Palestine Laboratory, is available to watch on Al Jazeera. But I should point out to people who aren't familiar with your work that you are an independent journalist. And I've been following your newsletter for years. It's an excellent way to keep up to date with all the different media appearances and book projects that you're working on. I encourage people to sign up to that on your website, and also the Declassified newsletter as well. We're also an independent journalism organisation, and we rely on donations from the public. And the more people who subscribe to this channel and like this video, the more reach that we're able to have with our media work. Antony, thank you for joining us today. I know you're incredibly busy. The film's just come out, and I will keep following your work with interest.
Thanks so much, Phil. I also encourage people to support independent media, because without us, you've got really dull mainstream press. God help us all. Thanks, Phil.